In today's video, I want to tell you everything we know so far about the Starlink Mini, and I want to talk to you also about some of the speculations that people have had. What's up, everybody? Welcome to Freely Roaming. My name is Dan. We're here in Ecuador. We're in this little village called Mindo, and it is well known for bird watching and wildlife. We've been in Ecuador for a few days now. This is our third stop, I think. So far, it's been a beautiful place. But today, I want to talk to you guys about Starlink Mini. There's been a lot of information out there circling around about Starlink Mini, and a lot of it has been kind of surprising. Some of it has been about what we expect, but there's also a lot of speculation and things that people don't exactly know, and that's sort of what we have to deal with right now because there's not a lot of official information. But what we do know so far are the specs of this dish. So let me give you guys some information about that to start with. The Starlink Mini is about half the size of the Gen 2 Starlink dish. It is 11.75 inches by 10.2 by 1.45 inches thick. It is a manual tilt dish, and from what I understand, it probably requires more orientation, more specific manual tilting than the Gen 3 dish because it is that much smaller. On the average, it uses about 25 watts to 40 watts of power, and that's with the snow melt function turned off. With snow melt function turned on, it uses a maximum of 60 watts, which is quite a bit less. It's about half of what the Gen 2 dish uses. And this is really the reason why people are so excited about this. The Starlink Mini, on paper, it looks like the perfect dish for nomads. For people that are powering this from a battery bank, from a limited power supply, which is not plugged into the wall, you're depending on solar, you have limited space. But the problem with that is that you also run into physical limitations with what you can do with such a small dish. It has the same phased array antenna system as all the other dishes, meaning that it uses the beamforming technology to track satellites in the sky. It has the same 110-degree field of view. It is directly DC powered using an external AC to DC power brick that plugs into the wall, which means that if you can feed the right power to the cable that feeds into the dish, you can feed this directly using DC power without any significant modifications. And what's really cool is that it is also USB-C power delivery compatible, as long as it is a USB-C PD 100 format, meaning it's 20 volts at 5 amps. What people know so far is that in the US, there's limited availability. Only people who have residential plans have been offered this, and only some people with residential plans have been offered this. And I believe it's based on capacity available. And with the residential plan, you're paying $120 a month to only be able to use it at the address that you have. The Starlink Mini that they were offered was offered at $600, $599 for the hardware. And with an additional $30, you can add this onto your residential plan as a second dish. Now, this second dish is for you to use as a sort of a roaming dish that you can take with you on trips, but it's limited at 50 gigabytes. So for an extra $30, you can use 50 gigabytes through the second Starlink Mini dish, which is not exactly ideal for people that were hoping to be able to replace their existing Gen 2 or Gen 3 dish with this smaller one and use it on the roam plan. So essentially what this does is that it kind of acts as a sort of a mobile hotspot when you compare it to like a traditional cell phone service. Cell phone service will give you a phone and you can add on a secondary device like a mobile hotspot for an additional fee that gives you a fixed amount of data. We have also recently found out that in certain Latin American countries, you're able to get this Starlink Mini dish and put on the roam plan. People have said that the plans with the Starlink Mini is actually significantly cheaper, like $35, but that's not actually true from what I can tell. It's available right now, I believe, in Panama, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Colombia. Maybe one or two others that I didn't see. But from all these different places, the dish is for sale for $200, which is an amazing price, significantly cheaper than what these add-on residential plans are being offered in the US. And to put on the Roam plan in these Latin American countries, it is the same fee, it's the same monthly price. You're just buying a different dish. You're basically using a different dish for the same exact Roam plan. It is not cheaper from what I can tell. So why is that the current situation? Well, there's a bunch of rumors and speculations, and I want to talk a little bit about those. One of the rumors, which I agree with, is that there's probably just excess capacity in these countries because when satellites zoom over the sky, it can service a fixed number of people for any given area. And the way that the satellites are going around the Earth, it's basically going around the Earth at the same rate across every piece of serviceable land. And if there isn't that many people in a given country that's using Starlink, the system is kind of just wasted. It's going over the skies of these countries and not being used. That might explain why these are the countries that they've chosen, but not the others, because Costa Rica is also a Central American country that isn't serviced. And Mexico obviously is close to Guatemala. And Nicaragua, Honduras, Belize, those countries I don't believe yet have service. But it doesn't explain why Colombia does also have Starlink Mini available, because we just recently switched to the Colombia plan. It doesn't make sense because we just had the price of our service raised by $20 a month. The second speculation people have had is about spectral efficiency. So spectral efficiency basically means given the same amount of spectrum, how much data can you push through? It is reasonable to say that with a smaller dish, you're going to be able to push through less data. However, in this particular case, it doesn't make any specific difference to Starlink as a business. Because people have talked about, oh, it's similar to when 3G upgraded to 4G and 4G upgraded to 5G. Eventually, the 3G service was taking up too much capacity, so they had to degrade it or they had to remove it altogether to make room for 4G. For cellular, it makes sense because they can physically go and replace the hardware. And 3G was using a frequency that 4G can also use. And because 4G technology can actually increase the number of users within a certain channel. So in that sense, within the same amount of spectrum, you can actually sell more service. But Starlink is different. Starlink obviously is based on satellites that are launched into the sky. Once the satellites are in orbit, there is no upgrading the hardware. So what technology it uses can only be upgraded via software. And what it uses is that it uses what's called 64 QAM, quadrature amplitude modulation. So 64 QAM, basically, if you look at a quadrant, similar to what you remember back in high school math, you have the x-axis and the y-axis. In these four quadrants, there are different areas that are designated to represent different 6-bit pieces of data. And it uses amplitude and modulation to be able to pinpoint exactly which pieces of data is being passed through. Because it is a smaller dish, it is probably going to have less throughput because it has less power and it requires more digital signal processing to be able to interpret and error correction. So while it's true that the spectral efficiency is going to be lower, but what isn't true is that it's going to bog down the network. Because for the same amount of people that are using the network, whether using a Gen 2 or a Gen 3 or Starlink Mini dish, you're not changing the capacity based on the number of users that can access each satellite at any given moment. So from Starlink's business perspective, it doesn't make any difference, or at least it shouldn't make any difference. If you can handle 1,024 users per satellite, it doesn't matter which dish they're using. And every one of these 1,024 users, if they're all on the same plan, they're all paying the same price. So from a business standpoint, the spectral efficiency speculation doesn't make any sense to me. And the next one is that there's limited hardware, so that the prices have to be higher at the beginning and the prices will drop. I hope that's the case. However, what doesn't make sense to me is that we are on basically the 5th or 6th dish that Starlink has ever released. They started with around Gen 1, and then the Gen 2, and then they had the high performance dish, and that's 3, and then they had the Gen 3 dish, that's 4 dishes, and this is the 5th dish, which is the Starlink Mini. It doesn't make any sense that all of a sudden, with the Starlink Mini dish, they're having production problems, because this is not a problem they've had in the past. They've also not had variable pricing when it comes to new dishes. Now, they have had them go on sale from time to time for different reasons, but the price basically has always come out to be about the same. It's always between $500 to $600. So for them to sell this in some of these Latin American countries for $200, it does make more sense that they're just trying to get people to buy these dishes for a lesser price and encourage them to use the capacity that is basically unused. So that's one of the reasons why I think that this is happening. They're testing the market. They're trying to see if they can get people to use the Starlink Mini. And maybe the stakes are a little lower if something happens to the Starlink Mini in these smaller countries that have less users, so that if there's any problems they have to work out, they can work it out during this time. Secondly, I think this could also be sort of an ego-driven thing. And as we know, the owner of Starlink is somebody who has a big ego. And for Starlink to be the first low Earth orbit satellite internet service provider, they want to show that they have the highest throughput. They have the best network, the fastest network. And if everybody bought Starlink Minis, even though it won't necessarily make their price or make their user base go down, it won't necessarily require them to have more satellites, because everybody will still be able to use it. Their speeds will just be slower, which means that their overall throughput over the network will be slower. It just won't look good on paper whenever they have to show people how much data have we pushed through our network, even though they'll make the same revenue. And because of that is why I think that even if everybody used Starlink Mini at a lower throughput, it wouldn't affect their overall business, but it will affect how they're perceived. So what do I think we can expect going forward? Well, it's Starlink. There's been a lot of changes, so anything can happen. But I suspect the Starlink Mini on the Roam plan will at some point be available widely. But it's probably not going to be sold in the US for $200 like it is in these Latin American countries. It will be somewhere between $200 and $600 is my suspicion, because there's a lot of Gen 2 dishes out there. And as of last year, there's more and more Gen 3 dishes that are out there. And because they basically lose money every time they sell a piece of hardware, they would rather people keep the dishes they have versus having everybody upgrade to buy this new dish just because it's the newest, coolest, sleekest thing. And lastly, is the Starlink Mini actually the best dish for nomads? Well, for a few reasons, yes, and for a couple of reasons, no. Obviously, it has great power consumption. It's really low. It's half of Gen 2. It's the lowest power consumption of all the Starlink dishes that are available today. It is easy to power using 12-volt power supply, so you can power it with no problems, and even with a small battery bank. And it's easy to recharge with solar. But it might not be good for flat mounting, because it is a smaller dish. It is going to be more sensitive to where it's pointed. In the manual, it does say that manual orientation of the dish is required, which means that if you have it flat mounted on your roof, you may experience more dropouts, more so than the Gen 2, definitely more so than the Gen 3, because there are physical limitations with the power consumption as well as the antenna array size of this dish. So in my opinion, Gen 2 is still the best overall dish for flat mounting and using for nomads. The only downside obviously is that converting to 12 volt is still a hassle. And from what I can tell, there's been a lot of software upgrades to the Gen 2 dish. It seems like at least once a week, I'm getting the upgrade your software alert in the Starlink app. And some of these upgrades I suspect are potentially affecting the ability to connect to some third-party routers. I have experienced recently that my router is taking longer for the lock on to the wide area network IP assignment that's coming from the dish. But because there are so many updates that are happening constantly, I will continue to update you guys with my experience. So there you go. Those are my thoughts about the Starlink Mini. And there's a lot of speculation, a lot of rumors, and most of the information that I've explained to you are sort of my takes on what I think the Starlink Mini is doing and what we can expect going forward. And hopefully, at some point, we're all going to be able to get one of these for us to try and have some real-world experience with the new Starlink Mini. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them in the comments below. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you guys in the next one.